This is Research Like a Pro, episode 134, The Daugherty Case, Part 2. Welcome to Research Like a Pro, a genealogy podcast about taking your research to the next level, hosted by Nicole Dyer and Diana Elder, accredited genealogy professional. Diana and Nicole are the mother-daughter team at FamilyLocket.com and the creators of the Amazon best-selling book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist's Guide. I'm Nicole, co-host of the podcast. Join Diana and me as we discuss how to stay organized, make progress in our research, and solve difficult cases. Let's go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show today. I'm Nicole Dyer, co-host of Research Like a Pro, and I'm here with Diana Elder, accredited genealogist, and my mom. Hi, Mom. How are you?
I am doing well. How about you?
Good. We have been working so hard on our new book coming out. How's it coming for you?
Well, I'm working on a work sample for it. So I think our listeners have heard me talk a lot about my Rachel Cox and Benjamin Cox DNA project. And so I have a series of research reports, and it's time to bring that all together into a proof argument. So that's what I'm working on, and that'll be part of the book. So I'm really excited to bring everything that's in my head and in the reports together in one document where I can show for sure that Benjamin Cox is the father of Rachel Cox. So that's a fun project.
Yay, that will be a good feeling. Well, let's continue on with our discussion of the Daugherty case. Last week, we talked about the beginning steps of the Research Like a Pro process to form an objective, make a timeline, analyze the known sources, and do some locality research. So I studied about Warren County, Kentucky, and my goal was to find the children of Robert Daugherty and his wife, Sarah Taylor. So the next step in the process is to create a research plan. For my research plan, I took my timeline and I just kind of grabbed out of that the known facts about Robert. I didn't put in some of the inferred parent-child relationships that other people had in their trees. I just put in what the evidence really showed about Robert from what I had started with. Is that how you do your known facts?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to do it, especially when you're starting with information that you haven't researched and you're taking it from other people's trees. Putting in just what you know for sure is a good way to start. And I do that. I like to take that timeline and take the most important facts from it and put it in a simple table just so I can refer back to it as I'm doing the research and remind myself of dates and places and what I know.
Agreed. Well, my summary of known facts just had the marriage record, the bond between Robert and his wife Sarah in 1784, and the fact that Robert was a witness for the bond of the marriage of his possible sister, Sarah Daugherty, when she married James Taylor. And then I put in my known facts some of the associates of Robert, including James Taylor, who could be his brother-in-law, and James Neal, who witnessed his bond as well. And the fact that Robert and James both signed with a mark, in case that was important or useful later. And then the one marriage that I had found that actually stated the parent-child relationship, which was Mary Daugherty when she married Jacob Romans, and Robert Daugherty gave consent for his daughter to be married to him. So I added that to my known facts. So I know Mary is his daughter. And then I know that he died before November 8th, 1843, when he was listed as deceased in his estate appraisal. So I also put a few things in the known facts from that estate record, that there was an unnamed widow left behind named Daugherty, and that the administrator of the estate was Peter Daugherty, and the fact that Robert Daugherty owned a theological book, which seemed to indicate that he was a reverend of some sort, and that there were several other witnesses to the appraisement that could have been relatives like H. McGinnis, Clausen neighbors, Philip Romans, and Peter Daugherty. So my known facts was pretty small. My timeline was pretty large, but a lot of the timeline was gathered from authored trees, so I just didn't know how much of it was accurate. So I tried to just go with what I knew was a fact, what was accurate about Robert Daugherty, and then I could weave in some of that other information with the evidence after I found more data. So that was my known facts for the research plan, and using that, it kind of informed what I would look at next. I wrote up the background information, just kind of what I learned from the locality research about the county and when records began there. The 1800 census for Warren County was missing, so I added a note about that. Then I wrote my working hypothesis, basically that Robert married Sarah soon after he signed the bond in 1784, that he probably had children who were born in North Carolina beginning soon after their marriage. And then he migrated to Warren County, Kentucky by 1811 when his daughter Mary got married there to Jacob Romans. And I'm guessing also my hypothesis that he might have had more children born in Kentucky. And I had seen in a family tree that maybe his first wife had died early and that he got married again. So I put that in my hypothesis to check out. And I also put that he was possibly a reverend and that he left behind an unnamed widow. So at this point in the project, I didn't know the widow's name. I found that later in my research. So then I listed out some possible methods that I could use to help me test this hypothesis. And one of them was to really search through those census records from 1810 to 1840 and analyze those and correlate them with the household makeup, and then search for marriage records for all the Daughertys in Craven County in 1800 to 1811, and then search for marriage records for Daughertys in Warren County from 1800 on. Because if his children were born starting in 1784, then they maybe could have been ready to get married by 1800. And then I also wanted to find the year of migration and the route that Robert Daugherty took from North Carolina to Kentucky, because if you remember, the purpose of this research project is to see if these could be the parents of John Robert Dyer, or maybe at least the mother could be his mother, if Sarah Taylor was the mother. So I wanted to see, maybe did they stop in Tennessee? Did they have any connection to Hawkins County, Tennessee at all, where John Robert Dyer was? And then I also thought it would be good to determine Robert's denomination and find church records. So those were kind of the methods that I listed after I made my hypothesis. The next part of my research plan was to identify sources. So I just brainstormed all the different record collections at the Family Search Catalog and at Ancestry that could answer some of those questions. And I found there were a lot of possible things that I had put in my locality guide, like court records and estate records. And I did find some possible church type things, biographies and history that might mention churches. Mostly I focused on looking at the marriage record collections because I thought those would be the most useful, and then court and estate records. So after listing out all those ideas, the last part of my research plan was to make a prioritized strategy. So I put these in order based on what I thought would be the most useful to do first. So since I had a record of his estate appraisal and inventory, I thought I should just make sure that I have all the records that were created because of his death and his estate. So I wanted to check more records in Warren County for wills and any other court records that might have had something mentioned about his estate, order books, and any other court records. So I put another court record book from 1803 to 1865 on there. Actually, that was the collection title. And within that, there were certain volumes that I prioritized. So volume 13, 1840 to 1842 of those court records, I wanted to check that. And then volume 14 through 15, which covered 1842 to 1848. So he died around 1843. So that was my first thing, was more records about his estate and death, just to make sure I have all the documents that went along with that. Then the next step I wanted to do was a census study where I correlate everything from 1790 to 1840 and really look at the household makeup. And then the next step was marriage records. First, I wanted to do Craven County, North Carolina marriage records, and then more Warren County, Kentucky marriage records. I just wanted to make sure I had all the children who got married and see if they have any more connections to Robert Daugherty. And then my last prioritized step was Kentucky laws, published about 1810, to find out more about what the age of consent was for marriage and what was the age that Mary Daugherty had to be under when the marriage bond was signed in 1811, which required her father to give consent. So was it under 16? Was it under 21? I wanted to know what that was. So that was my research plan. What do you think?
Yeah, I thought that was really interesting to have you go through all of that. And I liked how you did your hypothesis and then you had some ideas of what you could do. You know, you listed some methodology like searching census and marriage records, just getting all of your thoughts and ideas down and then going through and identifying the sources from your locality guide all the different things that you found that you could search, and then putting those into priority. And I think that doing the probate first is very beneficial. There's so much more that can be found in probate records sometimes than the initial record that we start with. And so, really exploring all of those can be so helpful, because you could have found a record that was the final administration and listed all of his children right there. I've got that for several different people. So you always want to go with that record that could be the most beneficial for your research. And then, of course, the census study, that is always so helpful. And then the marriages in the two locations and the laws. So I think that was a really good priority of the research. Good job.
Well, the next step was to actually follow my steps and record what I found in my research notes and my research log. So I use my research project document that has my objective and the research plan to record my extended notes, abstracts, and transcriptions that can't really fit in my spreadsheet log. And in the log, I put an entry for each URL that I look at because I'm doing this research online. And I put the URL and the source citation and some basic results and comments. So I started searching. I found some equity judgments in my first step and a court order that was really helpful in the order book. So that order book that I looked in helped me answer a question that I had about who the widow was. When I started the project, I just had that estate appraisal that mentioned the widow Daugherty, but didn't say her first name. And I had seen in family trees that maybe the first wife, Sarah, had died before this. So when I found the order book, it was very helpful because it said that Sarah Daugherty, the widow of Robert Daugherty, gave permission to her son, Peter Daugherty, to administer the estate. And that was in 1843 in Warren County. So I was really happy to find that detailed record telling me Peter was a son of the couple and that Sarah was the widow. And since Robert married Sarah and there was no other indication of him having another marriage, I could infer that this was the same Sarah Taylor he married back in 1784.
Oh, that was a great find. I bet you're excited when you found that. So great when you see actual relationships.
Yeah, it was great. Yeah, so these court books were digitized in Family Search and they had indexes in the front and sometimes in the back. So that was really helpful to be able to open up the image and not search through every page, but just look at the indexes that were handwritten in the front of the book.
Yes, I always do that. And sometimes I have found collections on Ancestry that have been indexed and they've only taken like one of the records. And so you miss everything else that's in that index. Sometimes they'll have the estate of an individual and then several page numbers listed where that estate is filled out throughout the book. So looking at those handwritten indexes is key to your research in those books.
Yes. Another thing that I had on my research plan was to find a will, but because they were appointing an administrator, I figured he died intestate. I did check the will books just in case there was anything there, and it did have a will for Philip Romans, who was possibly the son-in-law based on the timeline that I made and what I saw in family trees. So I grabbed that data and transcribed some information from that. And I reviewed all the census records, 1790, and then 1800 was missing for Warren County. He wasn't on the 1800 census for Craven County. So I'm guessing he left before 1800 because he wasn't in Craven anymore. But I can't check to see if he was in Warren yet because there was no census of Warren County for 1800. But then I did correlate the 1810 to 1840 census records with all of his other ones to figure out how many children he probably had. So then I searched the marriage records and I got a ton of hits for Dougherty's getting married in Warren County. And I didn't find any marriages at all that seemed useful after 1800 in Craven, which further gave me the thought that by the time his children were old enough to be married, they had left Craven.
Yeah, that's such a common time period too, because by 1800, you have got the West opening up a little bit more, and it's post-revolution, and the land there in North Carolina was used up, and so you really see a lot of migration west out of that area to these new lands, Kentucky and Tennessee. So knowing a little bit of the history, you can realize that yeah, that makes perfect sense.
Yes, the migration time. So, as I started searching in those marriage records of Warren County, I started finding a lot more Doughertys, and a lot of them I didn't recognize their names, and there wasn't a clue to who they were. So, I just started putting them all in my research log and figured I would sort it out after I gathered it all. After I did that, I looked at the family search tree and other published trees to see what other people had concluded about who the parents of these Doughertys were and tried to figure out how they figured it out. So then I started separating the marriages by what the trees had said. And I put Robert Dougherty's supposed children in one, and then Daniel Dougherty was the other person whose children were getting married in Warren County at this time. And I put them in a separate page in my log. Doing that helped me to have a starting point for figuring out who belonged to who. And then as I did that, I tried to look for clues and evidence that either confirmed that guess or made it so that I was wrong. And I did research on each person who got married to try to figure out more about them and added that to my log as well. So I ended up with 19 entries in my Daniel Dougherty sheet, and the most of them stayed over 98 rows in my Robert Dougherty sheet. So once I figured out that they were probably belonging to Daniel Dougherty, I didn't do much more research on them. And then the ones that I did find were Robert Dougherty's children, I focused on those. One of the things that was really helpful was correlating the census records. From the census records, I could kind of see the family makeup of Daniel Dougherty and Robert Dougherty and see how many children they had and what gender they were. So that helped a lot.
Oh, that's a really good use of those early census records because I think sometimes we wonder how to use those when you only have the head of household and then you've got the tick marks. And of course, they're super helpful because you have the makeup of the family and you can coordinate that like you did with the marriage records and other things going on. So, census and marriage together, it sounds like helped you to separate out the families and really figure out who the children were for Robert Dougherty.
It did. And then following these children forward in time after I found their marriages, that was another thing that I did to really cement the evidence and make sure they were in the right family. So after I finished my research log, the next step was to write a report.
And I bet it was not that hard to write the report because you had taken such good notes in your research log and your research project.
Writing the report always feels kind of like the first time you've written it, just because for me it feels like I'm finally putting everything together in one place. And so I've had a timeline where I could see things in a certain way. I've had my notes of what the documents are saying, like the transcriptions. And then I had my research plan, which kind of had a little bit of writing in it, which was the hypothesis. But now I'm finally just putting it all together. And it's really such a useful tool for fully grasping the state of the research.
And it's a finished product because it contains the citations from the research log, contains information from the research log, but organized in a way that it makes sense and helps you elaborate on those connections and really help your reader to understand all of the different things that you've figured out from this project.
Yeah, I put a table of contents because I had quite a bit of discussion of different things, and I organized it kind of by record and topic. I started with Dougherty widow, then I talked about Peter Dougherty because I had pretty strong evidence about both of those people. Then I went into correlating different census records and kind of followed it through a timeline. So it is in chronological order, telling the story of this family, how the daughters got married in Warren County, and then talking about the daughters and the evidence for them, and then continuing forward with the censuses and correlating that, and ending up with that marriage of Anna Dougherty that I mentioned in the last episode, who I did find was the daughter, and ending up with the 1840 census and the fact that Peter, the son, never married. But there was some interesting information about that I ended with. So it was a long report. It was 17 pages. The first section is the objective, and I allotted 30 hours for research and writing, so I put that limitation. And then the starting point, I just bullet pointed all of those known facts that I had already listed in my research log and put the citations there. And then in my background information, I added a map showing Warren and Butler counties and how they were neighboring to each other and how that's kind of where the Dougherty Taylor families went. And then I went straight into findings and correlation and talking about the Dougherty widow and how, there was actually an unsourced find a grave memorial for Sarah Taylor Dougherty that stated she died in 1828. So I really wanted to know, was she listed as that widow? And like I already mentioned, I did find that Sarah Dougherty was mentioned as the widow in a court order in 1843. So I contacted the person in that find a grave memorial just to say, where did you get this info? And are you sure it's right? Because I think she was still alive when her husband died. So I put that, and then I went on to Peter Dougherty and talked about how old he was based on some census records in 1850. And there were no other men with the same name, so it was probably just him. And how there is direct evidence that he was the son of Sarah Dougherty from that court order, and then we can infer that Robert was the father. And this was another key piece of evidence that I figured out while I was writing, that because that court order said that Sarah was the mother of Peter, we can know for sure that she was the woman who was married to Robert Dougherty when Peter was born in 1799. So this wasn't a second wife named Sarah. This was the same Sarah that he married in 1784 that was the mother of Peter in 1799 that is listed as the widow in 1843.
That's so great.
It was great to be able to prove that the find a grave entry for her death in 1828 was wrong, because this was the person that I was interested in the most, Sarah Taylor. And I wanted to know if she could have been the mother of John Robert Dyer. And one of the pieces of information that I had about John Robert Dyer is that he was an orphan when he got married in 1830. So if Sarah Taylor did die in 1828, that seemed to fit my story of what I was looking for. If she was still alive until 1843, it didn't fit my story. So I needed to know.
Oh, that's a good point. Well, I want to point out here to our listeners that for your report, you did it semi-chronologically. You're going to start talking next about the 1790 census, but you actually started with the death of Robert Dougherty. So you were starting with the person you knew was your person, and then you went back in time, right?
I did. I started with the known relationships, which were his widow and his son, Peter, from that death information.
Yeah, because I think sometimes we think we have to start with the earliest record always, but sometimes it's better to start with like a will or a probate record or something, putting things in place, and then to go back in time. Every project is a little different with how you organize that report. It's always good to outline it first and get your thoughts in order.
That's a good point. I didn't mention that, but outlining is really helpful. Sometimes I do that. I think this case, I just started writing and then I moved the sections around to order them later. I do a lot of editing as I go and just kind of think, oh, this would be better up here. And I copy and paste paragraphs and put them where they seem to be logical. And sometimes you can kind of feel that you're transitioning toward a record that helps add evidence to your current topic. So then I try to decide, like, do I want to put that here? Or is it going to be more logical to defer and talk about that later? It's so hard because all the evidence is so connected.
Well, and the good thing about writing it in a word processing program is you can move things around. Sometimes it's not till you finish writing it all out that you realize the best way to present the evidence.
Yep. So after talking about the widow and the son Peter, I went to the 1790 census and started working on just correlating who all the people were. So in 1790, there was one male over 16 and one male under 16 and two females, which ages were not given. And so I figured the one over 16 was Robert, the head of household, and the one under 16 was unknown. I figured it could be a son that we didn't know. I had already established that Peter was born in 1799, so it probably wasn't him, but it could have been anyone, laborer, relative, a known son. And then the females were probably the wife, Sarah, and one of their daughters. Then moving to the 1800 census, Robert was not found in the 1800 Craven County census. And the only Dougherty heads of household in Craven at that time had their name spelled a little different, Dority. And none of them were Robert and none of them were Daniel. And so I think Robert and Daniel had already left. There were a bunch of other people. There were Willis, Elizabeth, Richard, Owen, who was probably their father, Ephraim, and William. And so I wondered if some of them were half siblings because their father, Owen Dougherty, had married twice. So I just figured that the second family of Owen Dougherty stayed in Craven County. So Robert's absence from that 1800 census is consistent with the deeds that I found for him. While I was writing this report, I wanted to check because I had one deed that was in a family tree. And so I wanted to check and see if there were any other deeds. So I did find that he sold some land again in 1797 and then another deed in that same year. So it looks like he sold his land and probably left between 1797 and 1800. So this wasn't on my research plan to check it, but I already had one deed from my starting point. So I just decided to go get the rest of them as I was writing the report.
And sometimes that happens. You know, you're writing your report and then you realize, wait, I don't know this. And so that's one of the values of writing the report is filling in the holes.
Yeah. And then I mentioned that there's kind of a gap in census records for this family in the most important time when they were having little children. So, because there's no Warren County, Kentucky census for 1800, I just don't know what their family makeup was like in those younger years. And then before even the 1810 census, we start seeing their children getting married. So, my next section in the report is called Daugherty Marriages in Warren County, Kentucky. So I just said to locate Robert's children, every Daugherty marriage in Warren County was searched from 1800 to 1840. Some of the Daugherty marriages were the children of Robert's brother, Daniel. So before the project, Mary and Peter were already known to be the children of Robert. And then by correlating census and marriage records with estate records, Robert Daugherty and Peter Daugherty, three additional children of Robert Daugherty, were identified. Two of them were already married by the 1810 census, daughters Sina and Betsy. So I didn't mention this yet, but one of the ways that I could sort out all of the children, because there were so many marriage records for Doherty's, how did I know which ones were Daniel's and which ones were Robert's? And one of the most helpful things was looking at the names of the husbands of the daughters on estate records, because on Robert's estate record, a lot of his possible son in laws were the witnesses and people buying from the estate. So that's how I kind of knew that these possible daughters are his daughters because their husbands, Robert's son in laws, were buying from his estate and acting as witnesses and helpers in the process.
Those are really good clues.
Yeah, the next part just goes through Sina Doherty, talks about her marriage and the evidence. And this is kind of fun because I found more about the laws as far as how old you had to be. So I found that Kentucky law required that fathers give consent on the marriage license and bond if their child was not yet 21 years of age. So for Sina's marriage, Robert's consent was not mentioned on the bond. So I inferred that Sina was probably over 21 years of age in 1808 when she got married. And then I could use that to estimate when she was born. So if she was married in 1808 and was over 21 years, she was born before 1787.
Well, that's great use of the laws. We hear that all the time that you need to use the laws to put some context to those records. And every state did things differently. If you ever find the good reference for the laws for the place you're researching, make sure you save that because sometimes it's not easy to find those.
It always takes me a bit of research to figure this out. What I ended up finding for this particular law book was an image copy on Google Books for the Statute Law of Kentucky, published in 1810. And it was a compilation of the law with notes and observations on public acts, also including some information from Virginia because that's where Kentucky was created from. So it was just kind of going through the history of all the laws up until then.
And that's the type of information you'd want to put in your state locality guide. So every time you're researching in Kentucky, you can go straight to your link and not have to find it again.
Yes, I need to take that footnote from my report and add it to my Kentucky state locality guide.
Yeah.
It's funny how sometimes as I'm writing the report, I realize that I need certain things. And so then I go find them.
Mm-hmm.
So the next section was about the daughter Elizabeth, and she married Philip Romans in 1808. The marriage was solemnized by Robert Dougherty because he could do marriages. Anyway, so the father on the bond gave consent. So Robert Dougherty, the father of the intended wife, gave his consent. So we can tell that Betsy was under 21, so she was born after 1787. So now I can correlate that with the 1790 census, where there were two females, and assume that the first female was the mother, the second female was the oldest daughter, Sina, and the third daughter was Betsy, who was probably not born until after 1790.
And I noticed when you were writing this up, you did a little table of the 1810 census and the makeup of the household, and then you used the qualifiers was probably. because we never can know for certain in these situations if that is the exact tick mark for that exact person, even though it probably is. We still use qualifiers for the most part in our genealogy.
Yes. Yeah, so I have quite a bit of discussion in this section on Elizabeth Betsy Daugherty, and the Romans family, because the Romans family were close with the Daugherty family. And there was a Philip C. Romans who was mentioned on the appraisement bill in Robert Daugherty's estate. And I really kind of wanted to figure out who he was. So I guessed that he could have been the son of Philip Romans and Betsy Daugherty. And I found him on the 1850 census and found that his birth date occurred after the marriage of those two, and that the 1830 census for Elizabeth Romans included two males, so it could have been Philip Romans. So I thought maybe her husband died. So I just kind of put that in there. I didn't know for sure, but that's what I found. And I thought that showed pretty good evidence that tied the Romans family closely with the Doherty family, that he was on the appraisement. So Elizabeth actually got married again after her first husband died. So I traced that forward in time to kind of figure out where she went and find her on all the census records and see what the census records of her later life said about when she was born. So I concluded that she was probably born about 1791 to 1792 based on her records later in life. So then she would have been about 16 or 17 when she married Philip Romans.
Nice.
So, yes, like you mentioned, I did correlate all these marriage records and birth estimates with the 1810 census. And I just guessed that Robert was probably the male over 45 and Sarah was probably the female over 45, both born before 1765. And that Peter was the male aged 10 to 16. And that correlates with his birth in 1799 from the 1850 census. And then Mary was probably the one 16 to 25. And so, since she was not on the 1790 census, she was probably born between 1790 and 1794. And then I had this one other daughter, probably the female age 0 to 10, that we don't know who it is yet, who was born 1800 to 1810. Next, I decided to add the marriage of Mary to Jacob Romans here in the next section. And you will recognize the name Romans because two of the daughters seem to have married into the Romans family, Philip Romans and Jacob Romans. 1 year after this 1810 census, that daughter Mary got married and left the home. And we had already known about this marriage before we started. So I just mentioned this briefly. And because Mary's father was required to give consent, we can calculate that her birth happened after 1790 by taking 1811 and subtracting 21.
So there's something interesting in this record. In this record, Robert Daugherty actually signs his name. And I noticed in an earlier record back in the Carolinas where he signed with his mark.
Mm-hmm.
So it appears that somewhere he got some education and learned how to write. And, with him being a minister or a reverend now or performing marriages, it just kind of makes you wonder what happened in between.
Right. I also noticed with his signatures that he always used like a lowercase d for his surname, which I thought was interesting. And he spelled his name with an A, Robart.
Yeah, interesting.
Anyway, I did enjoy looking at his signature. So the next census was 1820. And by then I kind of decided that these older daughters are all gone. Then I'm just trying to figure out who's left. So we have Robert Doherty, who's probably the male over 45 years, born before 1775. Sarah, who's probably the woman over 45, also born before 1775. And then there's one more female left, age 10 to 16, born 1805 to 1810. So, who is this last probable daughter? Peter Doherty was no longer living at home anymore, so I looked to see if he was the head of household, and sure enough, I found him all by himself, age 16 to 25, with no other members of his household. So, there's this other daughter that I haven't decided who she is yet. There's tons of marriage records, but some of them belong to Daniel Doherty. So, I was just trying to figure out which one is the daughter.
Yeah, which one would make sense?
And then I looked at the next, which was the 1830 census. And we have again Robert and Sarah. I think they were listed as like age 60 to 69 and 70 to 79. And so I kind of wondered why Sarah was listed as being older. It could have been that she was born in 1760 and Robert was born in 1761.
They could have been on the edge.
It's just a range. And then there was a woman aged 20 to 29. So it could be that same possible daughter, just aging by 10 years. born about 1801 to 1810. And then there's a little boy, age 5 to 10. I don't know who this is. I thought maybe he was a son or a grandson. And if Sarah was 60, which would be the youngest for her range, and the boy was 5, she would have been 55 when he was born, and it's not very likely she was the mother of this boy. So I just put that it was more likely that he was a ward or a grandson, and he was probably born about 1821 to 1825. And at first I was like, oh, is this John Robert Dyer? But no, I know John Robert Dyer was not in Kentucky in the 1830 census, and he was born in 1810 to 1813. So it wasn't him.
Well, and they were getting old. Maybe they just hired a boy to help out around the house or in the farm, chop the wood. Could have been a 10-year-old and just been working. So many scenarios.
I actually found that he was enumerated twice in 1830, and the ages were a little bit different for the two of them. Sarah was 60 to 69 instead of 70 to 79.
Oh, interesting.
So sometimes they're wrong.
That's why we coordinate all the evidence and we don't just rely on one record to tell the story.
And those tick marks can be in the wrong place sometimes.
Yep.
Which is frustrating because you just wonder, like, okay, can I base my whole case on this one tick mark?
I know.
Luckily, usually can correlate several years. So the last part of these marriage records, I finally decided that this marriage of Anna Daugherty to John Manning in 1840 was probably this last daughter in the census records. There was a bond indicating John Manning was intending to marry Anna Daugherty, and Robert Daugherty did not perform the marriage. Maybe he was retired by then, but the rites of matrimony were performed by William Sublett instead, which was a neighbor. They were found on the 1850 census, this Anna Daugherty who married John Manning. So I found them in 1850, and Anna was 45 years old, born in Kentucky about 1805, which matches all those previous census years in 1810, 20, and 30 in Robert Daugherty's households. And when she died in 1880, she was buried in the Romans Spencer graveyard, which I thought was really good evidence tying her to the Romans family, who was so closely tied to the Robert Daugherty family.
Yeah, you've got the fan club running all the way through this.
Mm-hmm. And then I just had a little section with a little more evidence for this parent-child relationship. I just had 2 bullet points of 2 more clues that gave additional evidence that Anna was the daughter of Robert, the fact that John Manning had purchased an item from his estate, and then the fact that John Manning was a surety on the estate administration of Peter Daugherty, which was Robert's son. So finding that evidence linking John Manning to both Robert and his son Peter really was the nail in the coffin for proving Anna was the last daughter of Robert.
I agree. Yeah, you always want to look closely at who purchased the items in the estate sales. They're likely the neighbors, they're likely the family, and you want to figure out every single relationship that you can for those purchasers. So good job. That's great.
Yeah, I didn't get to really finish researching Anna Daugherty Manning all the way out to see if that possible grandson was her son, like an illegitimate son or something. But I wanted to add that to my future research. But the 1840 census showed that Robert and Sarah were all alone, age 70 to 79 and age 80 to 89, and that they had an enslaved female with them, age 10 to 23, which they had never had any slaves before, so that was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Probably, again, someone helping around the house because they're getting pretty old. Yeah, that is interesting, though, that they chose to, rather than hiring a servant or having a family member, that they purchased a slave. I wonder if there'd be any bills of sale or anything to know
Good idea.
where that female came from.
I also wondered if Peter was the one who encouraged that, because their son Peter had many slaves. And actually, very last section of my report talks about Peter and how he never married, and he lived alone in his first census in 1820. And then in 1830, he had 2 other people, a younger male who was age 15 to 19, and then a female enslaved person aged 10 to 23. I couldn't find Peter in 1840, but in 1850, he was age 51, and he lived near a man named Andrew J. Daugherty. And I didn't know who he was. I just put in my future research to determine how they might be related. But he also had a few other people in his household.
Well, I bet you anything that that enslaved female from 1840 belonged to Peter because the estate did not mention an enslaved person. And if she had been property of Robert Daugherty, she would have showed up in that estate inventory because because unfortunately the enslaved were listed as inventory. So I wonder if the son had just seen his parents needing some extra help and sent someone over to work on their place with them.
Yeah, and in the 1850 slave schedule, I found that Peter was on there owning 9 slaves, including a female age 42, and then a bunch of children aged slaves. I had heard a rumor from other Daugherty researchers that Peter married his slave or had children with his slave. And so when I was looking at this, I thought, well, could this slave who's age 42 be the mother of all these children by him? Because there's an enslaved male age 21, an enslaved male age 18, male age 14 and 12, a female age 10, another male age 10, and a male age 7 and a male age 6. And those were the slaves he owned in 1850.
Wow, that totally could be it. That does look like a family. He couldn't marry her, but they could have lived together and had all of those children. Interesting.
So there's quite a bit more to do on this family and flesh it out. I really enjoyed finding all these clues and putting them into my future research. Back to that Andrew J. Dougherty, who lived near Peter, one of my commenters in the study group mentioned as they read my report that maybe this Andrew was the 15 to 19-year-old in Peter's household in 1830, who I didn't know who he was. So there's a lot of little clues here that I could continue working on.
There is so much more research that could be done, right? My question is, what happened to all of his enslaved people in his household? If he died intestate, he didn't have a chance to write a will, and the estate was distributed by someone. They went somewhere. So, oh, I sure would love to know what happened to all of them. That'd be such interesting research.
I'll have to do another phase of research on this because I'm still uncertain how the DNA matches descending from this couple are related to my Dyer family.
Right.
It could be that they are just double cousins through the common ancestral couples of both parents of this couple. So Owen Dougherty, and then the Taylor parents, which are Moses Taylor and his wife. So it could be that those are the common ancestral couples, and there's two, and that's why they're showing up as being closer matches than you would think,
That's
sharing,
true.
50 centimorgans and stuff.
Right.
So I'm just going to have to sort out all these Dougherty and Taylor families one at a time.
Yep. You've got a good start, and you've got your research log, and you've got this report. You don't have to start over again. You can just do another project, maybe focusing just on Peter or whatever else you decide you want to do. So that's the beauty of a research log and a report.
Yes. When I wrote this report, I wanted to practice making a genealogical summary like you sometimes see in the NGSQ. So at the end, after I had proven all these children, each one was kind of a proof summary for who was a child of Robert and Sarah. So at the end, I did a genealogical summary of, Robert Dyer was born such and such. He married Sarah Taylor on this date, and Sarah was born this time, daughter of Moses Taylor and Elizabeth Pratt, and her death date. And then the known children of Robert Dougherty and Sarah Taylor. And then I numbered them, Sina, Elizabeth, Peter, Mary, and Anna. And it was so fun to write that summary after all of the evidence that I had found and put that into a succinct summary of the family.
And it looks beautiful. I love how it's very succinct and tells you exactly how you know what you know. That's great.
And then the last section was my future research, and I have about 15 bullet points here of different ideas of things to do. One of them was to find land and tax records for the Robert Dougherty family and to work on fleshing out the daughters a little bit more, like John Beasley and Sina Dougherty in the 1820 census, and correlating people in the Elizabeth Romans household with online trees to see if it matches up with her known children, and just continuing on with all the children and tracing them forward.
Well, this was a great project to really walk all the way through it. We've talked a lot about the Dyers and the Doughertys and Sarah Taylor, and so it was fun to just go through a complete project and see how you took a couple that you knew nothing about and really fleshed out their families and added a lot of proof to a lot of the relationships. So now, you have a solid foundation for going forward with the DNA as well as future research. So good job.
Yes, and all you listeners who are interested in reading the final report for this phase of the research, I will share that in the show notes. So you can click on the Google Doc link, or maybe I'll post it as a PDF or something. And then you can go ahead and read it if you want.
Yeah, I think that writing a report can be intimidating to a lot of people, and reading reports is a really great way to learn how to write your own. You kind of can get a feel of how you put things together when you're trying to write genealogical information. So go read it and enjoy. It's a great report.
All right. Thanks everyone for listening. We hope you got something out of that. And as always, if you would like to leave us a review, that would help us so much. And if you have anything that you would suggest we talk about on the podcast, please email us because we're always looking for new topics.
All right, everyone. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening. We hope that something you heard today will help you make progress in your research. If you want to learn more, purchase our book, Research Like a Pro, A Genealogist Guide, on Amazon.com and other booksellers. You can also register for our Research Like a Pro online course or join our next study group. Learn more at FamilyLocket.com. To share your progress and ask questions, join our private Facebook group by sending us your book receipt or joining our eCourse or study group. If you like what you heard and would like to support this podcast, please subscribe, rate, and review. We hope you'll start now to research like a pro.